Hello, I'm Katherine Murphy, a doctorate student at Liberty University. During today's presentation, I will be discussing the anti-literacy laws in the South and how they impacted both free and enslaved Black people between the late 18th century through the 1960s. Although most educators began teaching about anti-literacy laws in the United States after the American Revolution, there were laws in place forbidding both free and enslaved Black people from learning to read and write prior to the American Revolution. One of these was the Negro Act of 1740 in South Carolina. This law was passed in response to the Stono Rebellion in 1739, and it made it illegal for enslaved African people to do several things, including learning to read. However, most individuals have been taught about the Nat Turner Rebellion that occurred in Virginia in 1831. I was personally unaware that prior to this rebellion, Virginia had passed a law in 1819 that prohibited free and enslaved Black people from meeting for educational purposes. This was during a time where many educational philosophers felt that all people needed to learn to read the Bible, including Black people, and the state had made it illegal for them to meet to learn. The laws continued to be passed after the Nat Turner Rebellion that made it illegal for Black people to learn and read and write, and this continued through the next several decades. Many historians attribute the idea of taking away the right to learn to read and write was from fear of the Southern white people, that if Black people did learn to read and write, that there would be more rebellions and revolts against them. In history, we often see this method employed when one group of people wants to force control over another group of people. Anti-literacy laws continue to be passed and put into place throughout the United States up to the end of the American Civil War. At the end of the American Civil War, there was hope that Black people who had been emancipated under the 13th Amendment and granted citizenship under the 14th Amendment would see an end to anti-literacy laws in the United States. However, Sandals wrote that at this time, 90% of enslaved Black people who are now emancipated were illiterate, and only about 25% of Black people who had been free were literate. This meant that they needed pathways to learn to read or write. Once we entered the Reconstruction era of the United States in the 1890s and through the 1960s, Black people faced laws that disenfranchised them, including laws that made it difficult for them to learn and read. Though anti literacy laws had been outlawed during this time, there were restrictions that were placed on Black people in the United States that made it difficult for them to be able to do things in society that should have been granted to them under the 13th and 14th Amendment to the Constitution. These were put in place known as the Jim Crow laws. One of the Jim Crow laws that was put into place was the requirement to take a literacy test in order to vote in elections. This was mainly against illiterate Black individuals because illiterate white individuals were able to find loopholes around this law in order to be able to vote. Part of the reason that the Black population in the United States during this time had difficulty still learning to read and write was due to school segregation that we saw, the idea of separate but equal be created after the Plessy versus Ferguson case, where it stated as long as Black children had the equal opportunity to learn, then those schools were considered equal to the schools of the white people. However, historically, we know that Black schools were not given materials that were conducive to learning to read or write. So even though we had anti literacy laws that had been done away with, we were still seeing the Black population at this time be disenfranchised because of these restrictions that were put into place that were coined as the Jim Crow laws and not anti literacy laws. In summary, anti literacy laws were initially passed to keep Black people from learning to read or write in order to avoid additional rebellions as they had occurred during the Stono Rebellion and the Nat Turner Rebellion. Uprisings and rebellions like this were a major fear for white people during this time, and them taking away the ability for Black people to learn to read or write was a way for them to maintain control. Punishment for violating these laws could include imprisonment, being whipped publicly, fines, or even put to death. These punishments were meant as a way to deter other individuals from attempting to teach Black people to read or write in order to not be punished for doing so. Anti-literacy laws were outlawed after the American Civil War with the passing of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution. However, several states were able to violate these laws by passing requirements to read a test prior to being able to vote that were specifically put out for Black people, as illiterate white people were able to find loopholes around this requirement and still be able to vote. However, these laws also impacted schools, making it more difficult for Black people to learn to read or write because of the impositions that were placed on them, which is a topic for another presentation. Thank you for listening to my presentation today.